Now we will spend 1 hour on population of India and demographic transition theory. The first population census in India was taken in 1871, but it was not a synchronous census. It was the first population census of India, and conducting census in a large and diverse country like India was a difficult task. To count total number of persons at one point of time in a vast country like India, vast, diverse, which means people living in coastal areas, in hilly regions, in snowy areas, in Himachal Pradesh, in Sikkim, in Odisha, remote tribal areas. To conduct census in India is not an easy task. So in 1871, a beginning was made. And the figures of population from 1881 onwards are therefore more realistic. These are tentative estimates. In 300 BC, means about 2,300 years ago, the size of population is estimated to be around 100 to 140 million. And these figures are taken from estimates prepared by different people. Not one person, several demographers, paleodemographers, anthropologists, historians made estimates of population figures, and according to them, the population of India fluctuated between 100 and 200 in much of the history till 1871. As recent a date as 1871, virtually till the end of 19th century. Till the end of 19th century, the population of India was around 255 million. But when it comes to 20th century, in 1901, our census gave a figure of 238 million. 11 census gave a figure of 252 million. 21 census 251. 31 census 278. 41 census 318. 51 census 361. 61 census 439. 71 census 548. 81 census we have a figure of 683. 91 census 846, and 2001 census 1028, and 2011 census 1210. This is India's population. India's population in much of human history was fluctuating around 100. Sometime it increased, sometime it decreased. And 1871 census gives the maximum figure. When you adjust these figures for change of boundaries of India's political administrative area, then in 1901 census we have, this is the large undivided India. For the present day India, these figures are more reliable. These are from censuses and adjusted for changes in political boundaries of India. So in 1901, our population was 238. And then in 11 census, 252, and then there is a decline. Actually, we can say that in the past, population remained stationary. Sometimes it increased at a slow rate, sometimes it decreased, sometimes it decreased also. This decrease in population is because in 1918 there was a big influenza epidemic which affected most parts of India and in which lakhs of people died. So because of epidemics and food shortage, people will die. This situation continued more or less till 1941. The rate of growth of population in 1941 was 1.33, 1951, actually you can see till 1951, the rate of growth percent per year. On the basis of these two figures, if you calculate rate of growth of population, then 1951 population figure showed a rate of growth of 1.25% per year. Before this, around this time, you can say almost 0% or point something percent rate of growth. Before 1901, population of India was more or less stable, 100 to 255. In more than 2000 years time, population increased from 100 to 255, doubled, only doubled. In more than 2000 years time, population merely doubled. So population grew at a very small pace, sometime increased, sometime decreased. After 1951, population starts rising. 1951 census gave the rate of growth of 1.25%. 1961 census gave 1.96, then 2.20, then 81 census gave a growth rate of 2.2%, which was highest. Then it declined to 2.16, then 1.97, and now it is 1.64. So the highest rate of growth of India's population, which was ever observed, was 2.22% per year during 1971 to 81. Now growth rate has started declining. 2011 growth rate is 1.64. India's population is still growing according to these figures at rate 1.64% per year. And if a population continues to grow at rate 1.64% per year, then 70 by rough calculations, 1.64, nearly 40 years. In 40 years' time, population will double. That means 40 years from now, in 2050, the population of India has potential to become 2.4 billion. In 2001, first time India's population gave a figure of more than 1 billion. In 2001, India's population was of the same size as the world population in 1820. This is the rate at which population is increasing, and this is the meaning of population explosion. Unprecedented rise in rate of growth of population. And that is the reason why population became a subject of research in the second part of the last century. Population was never researched so much as in the second part of the last century. Issues have been changing, but why population grows at such a rate? Now, one theory that explains this rise and fall in population is called demographic transition theory. I will just give a brief description of demographic transition theory and show the difference between developed and developing countries. According to demographic transition theory, you can divide the history of population growth, demographic transition theory. Primitive society, developing, developed. If you broadly divide population or history of development or a society into three parts: a primitive stage, a developing stage, and a developed stage. Different countries are at different stages at different times. But these are broadly three stages of development: primitive, developing, and developed. In primitive society, our death rate may be defined as number of deaths in a year divided by average population. Death rate. Death rate is number of deaths divided by average population and multiplied by 1000. So in primitive stage, death rates were high and fluctuating. On the average, death rates were around 50 per 1000. But sometimes death rates will go up to 250, 300, 400, 500 also. For those cities in which in some year plague eliminated half of the population, then death rate was 500 per 1000 population. So death rate was high and fluctuating. If there is no epidemic, if there is good rainfall, if there is no war, then death rate is low, maybe 30, 40, 20. When there is epidemics or war, pestilence, death rate goes up, maybe up to 500. Very high fluctuation. And gradually with socio-economic development, first these fluctuations go and the death rate becomes more smooth and gradually it starts declining. It will never become zero, but death rate is like this. Death rate was 50 per 1000. In developed society, it is 7 to 8 per 1000. So death rate has decreased. This is the reason why population started growing at a fast rate. That at one time, maybe not in very distant past, only in 300 years ago, our death rate was as high as 50 per 1000 population. So people died and population was kept under check. When death rate started declining, and it has declined to a level of 7 to 8 per 1000. When death rate was 50, at that time life expectancy, average life of a newborn baby was as low as 20 years. Now it has gone up to more than 80 years. Life expectancy denoted by E0 has gone beyond 80. Now a newborn child can be expected to live for 80 years. At one time, out of all the children born, nearly 1/3 died before celebrating their first birthday. Infant mortality, this is called infant mortality rate. Number of deaths of infants divided by total number of children born. So death rate was very high, 300. Now death rate in several countries, infant mortality rate is as low as 3. When 1,000 children are born, hardly 2 or 3 die in infancy, and almost everyone celebrates his or her first birthday. Actually, no, today in the developed countries, almost all are assured of surviving up to 50. People start dying only after 50. All children born today in the developed countries have a very high probability of surviving up to 50. After that, heart diseases, cardiovascular, cancer, neoplasm, accidents, and diseases of old age, diabetes, kidney, blood pressure, they will appear and people will start dying. But at least up to 50, almost all are secured. That is the reason why population grows at a fast rate. Now, during this time, when death rate was high, the reasons are epidemics, wars, natural disasters, so for mankind to survive, it was important that maximum number of children are produced. Otherwise, human population will not survive. So you find in religious literature, in philosophy, in mythology, in folklores, in folk literature, there is always encouragement for producing more children in all religions. In Islam, in Christianity, be fruitful and multiply. Women are like your fields, you cultivate them and produce more children. Bathe in milk and produce 100 sons was the blessing that Hindu couples received at the time of marriage. Because otherwise, if fertility is not put at the maximum level, human society was not surviving. For the survival of human society, it was must that fertility is maintained at the highest level. So, the average number of children, we call in demographic language, we call it total fertility rate. This was maybe around 10 children. There are records to show that maximum number of children ever produced per woman could be as high as 11 to 12 children. In the last century, in one tribe of United States called Hutterite, average fertility of 11 point something was found. This is average. Some women had 20, some women had 2. Average was 11. In Uttar Pradesh, when I was a student and first time I did any field work as a sociologist, and my field work was done in a neighboring district, Etawah. In rural areas at that time of Etawah district, total fertility rate was 8.2 children. Means on the average, a woman before reaching 45 years had produced 8.2 children. So that was okay. Fertility is also high, birth rate is high. There are complications like when death rate is low, birth rate may be high. When death rate is high, birth rate may be low, and so on. But since we are only talking in a very general sense, so in this situation, birth rate was also high. Now what happened here, when death rates started declining, birth rates remained high for some time. And there was a time when the gap between birth rate and death rate is high. This is the cause of population explosion. Death rate has declined, birth rate has not declined. Birth rate remains high. If birth rate also declines, then you again reach a position when population stops growing, a condition of zero population growth that all of us want to achieve, zero population growth. In sociological language, there was an equilibrium, a social order, equilibrium. Both birth and death rates were high and population was in equilibrium. Population did not grow and no serious disturbance was created in the institutional framework of society. Now, disturbance is created, disequilibrium is created by the decline in death rate. And it takes some time for birth rate also to decline. It is easier to control death rate than to control birth rate. When death rates decline universally in all parts of the world. There was no opposition. There is no opposition to DDT spray. There is no opposition to antibiotics. There is no opposition, religious or political opposition to sulfur drugs. There is no religious opposition to anesthesia or surgery. No religion, no culture opposed. Only maybe in some rare cases like in India due to political reasons or mistrust, some Muslims opposed administration of polio drops. But that is not such an important issue. There were reports that minorities, as they are suspicious of the intention of government, may react in this way. So at some places there was opposition to polio drops, and Muslims thought that government of India is doing something through which Muslim children, boys and girls, will become sterile and they will not be able to produce any child. So in villages of Muslim majority districts like Rampur, Badaयूं, Bareilly, there was opposition to polio. But by and large in human history, you do not find any, because nobody wants to die. All of us will die, that is a fact, but nobody wants to die, and no religion, no political state ever opposed programs for reducing mortality. But when it comes to fertility, then people become very touchy. I am not saying that any community was at fault. We know that during emergency period, excesses were committed, and the fault, if there was a fault, certainly that is with the state. But just to give you an example of how people differ in attitude towards this and this, in Muzaffarnagar district, in family planning program, when the state machinery was involved in family planning program, which means sterilization at that time, there were violent conflicts, riots, and more than 50 Muslims were killed in police firing because they did not want to get sterilized. These excesses. So on the one hand, there was excess on the part of the state, and similar incidences took place. It became an international news, and Prime Minister had to mention this and defend this in the parliament. There was never such an opposition to death rate in no country, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, anything. So death rates could be reduced. Birth rate cannot be reduced so easily. So there is a time when difference between birth rate and death rate is high. So in the past, both were high, and therefore population was not growing or growing at a very slow pace. And this remained the situation for lakhs of years. Only during last 200 years or so, this equilibrium between birth and death rate was disturbed, and more so in the developing countries. Developed countries, I must say something about the differences between developed and developing countries. In developed countries, Germany, France, UK, death rates started declining sometime around 1750. And it took a long period of time, say up to 1950, and death rates are still declining. 200 years, more than 200 years. In developed countries, it took more than 200 years time for death rates to decline. So the change in death rate was slow, and birth rate also declined almost simultaneously. Now birth rate is, in several countries, birth rate is lower than death rate. So this population did not explode. Certainly there were periods when population growth was positive, and the intellectuals and philosophers in the developed countries started talking about population growth. In 1820, world population reaches first billion, 1930, second billion. Up to 1930, the growth of world population was mainly because of decline in death rate in the developed countries. So population was growing only in the developed countries. And roughly 20% of the world population lived in developed countries. 80% lived in less developed countries. Asia, Africa, Latin America, broadly. In less developed countries or developing countries, including India, what happened? That if this is 1950, okay, if this is 1950, till 1950, death rates remain very high. In some countries, there may have been some decline, but by and large, death rate remained high. And around 1950, suddenly, there is a reduction. Birth rate was high, it should have been high for equilibrium. Birth rate remained same. And birth rate starts declining around 1970s. So during this time, 1950s and 60s, there is population explosion. During this time, between 1950 and 1970, there is population explosion. This is the time when you find that India's population is growing at rate 2.2% per year. In the developed countries, the maximum rate ever observed in any country would be in decimal points, 0.8%. Maximum. In some countries like France, both birth and death rates declined almost simultaneously. So there was no problem, there was no population explosion. And Paul Ehrlich and other demographers, biologists, ecologists, who were writing on concepts like population explosion, population bomb, they had the situation of less developed countries in mind, where in around 1950, death rates declined suddenly. 1 year. It did not take 200 years. 1 year. In some countries like Sri Lanka, around 1945, in just 1 year time, death rate fell by 50%. And the cause was DDT spray. DDT spray alone by controlling malaria and maybe controlling some other infectious diseases also, or attacking at malnutrition infection syndrome, infection leading to malnutrition, making you more prone to infectious diseases. DDT spray. In just 1 year time in Sri Lanka, death rate declined by 50%. But otherwise in all the developing countries, in 1950s, death rates fell, and death rates fell irrespective of their economic development, social development, political institutions, religion, language, culture, irrespective of everything. In all the less developed countries, death rates decline. So there is population explosion, birth rate has not declined. In India itself, at the time of independence, or even up to 1950, death rate of India was 40 per thousand. So a high death rate continued in India for a long time. As late as 1950, death rate of India was 40. But then suddenly after that, after 1950, thanks to health infrastructure developed by Government of India, primary health center, community health centers, district hospitals, super specialties, gradually we started developing health infrastructure, improvement in doctor population ratio, awareness campaigns, fight against superstitions, magic, witchcraft, education, development, urbanization. With all those things, our death rates have declined further. So today India also has a very low death rate of around 8. And our life expectancy in 2012, our death rate in India is around 8, slightly less than 8 per thousand, and our life expectancy is around 66. In 1901, in the beginning of the century, up to 1921 actually, in 1921, life expectancy of India was only 20 years. A newborn child in India in 1921 was expected to live for 20 years only. Today, a newborn child in India is expected to live for 66 years. There is still a gap. There is a big gap between developed countries and India. But when you compare India of 2012 with India of last century, there is remarkable improvement. So our life expectancy has gone up from 20 to 66. Our death rate had declined from 40 to less than 8. Our infant mortality rate has declined from nearly 150 to 50 per thousand childbirths. This is the reason. And this is what demographic transition theory says. Demographic transition theory says that in ancient society, death rates are high and fluctuating. The reasons are epidemics, wars, natural disasters. And for mankind to survive, it is important that fertility levels are maintained at the highest level. So you find that there is encouragement to fertility. If fertility was as low as it is today, and death rate was as high as it was, then human society would not survive. Then we will not be here. There will be no population today, no IITs, no education. So it was important that fertility must be kept at a high level, equilibrium. To maintain the equilibrium, fertility was maintained at a high level. Now, due to several reasons, mortality starts declining. Nobody knows exactly why mortality declined. A layman's attention may be drawn towards improvement in medical sciences, but the demographers and sociologists who have studied this phenomenon say that mortality declined not because of invention in medical sciences, but because of other factors. Only later, improvement in medical sciences and health infrastructure may have played a role, but mostly the factors are related to rise of nation state. One big factor, rise of nation state. You see, rise of nation state means that there is more order, political order, there is a big country, and the fights, violent, bloody fights between the small kingdoms go away. We may not realize how important this fact is. I would say that even in the less developed countries and in the context of India, this rise of nation state, Indian nationalism, is a major contributory factor to decline in mortality. What happened 1,000 years ago or even later? Small kingdoms. And for regions unrelated to well-being of people, it was like a king of Kanpur abducts daughter of the king of Kannauj or Unnao or Lucknow, and that leads to war. And in the war, thousands of people die. Now today, we have a nation state India. Abductions still take place, but there is a law to deal with them, and they are so few that they make a national news. They are very few. There have been communal riots in India, and some of them quite violent. Bhagalpur, Gujarat, Punjab suffered from communal tension. But maximum of a few hundreds, rarely number of deaths in communal riots touches a figure of 1,000. So rise of nation state. Earlier, because of small kingdoms, conflicts between kingdoms, war, intense wars between tribes, small tribes often fighting with each other. Death rate, this was one major factor. Then labor laws, protection of the condition of workers. At one time, there was no protection to workers, and a large number of deaths took place in urban areas, in centers of industry, because of industrial hazards, industrial accidents, long working hours, low income. Some researches have shown that in Bombay at any time, Bombay was a small industrial place. Majority of people were migrants, and migrants of recent origin, because as it was said that people used to go to Bombay to die. People from rural areas will go to Bombay to work in industries. And the rate of accidents in industry was so high, and working hours were so long, that within a few years, the new migrants to Bombay will die, and they will be replaced by new people. Unlike the situation of today, urban areas had very high death rates as compared to rural areas. So improvement in labor laws, improvement economic condition, economic development, transport and communication, today, if there is a famine in some small part of the world, immediately the whole world knows about that. Your major TV channels start showing deaths and devastations when they occur in any small part of the world. Medical science is important, but that played a minor role in improvement in death rate. Why did birth rate decline? Birth rate declined, again, it's not very clear why did birth rate decline. In the Western countries, birth rate declines because the parents, the couples, realize with education, with economic development, with the structural changes, they realize that it will be more conducive for them and for their children to have a small number of children. I remember in Population and Development Review long back, an article was published which used the metaphor of social capillary. That social capillary was the reason why birth rate declined in European countries. Capillary, you know, in physics, the idea of capillary. In capillary tube, the height of a column of liquid will be more if the radius, inner radius of the tube is less. That was. So using that idea, a social scientist was arguing that people realize that if they have a small number of children, like the radius, inner radius of the capillary tube, then the possibility of movement of their own and also of their children will be more. So at a time, economic development was taking place in developed countries on their own, sometimes despite opposition from government. In Catholic states, government put all kinds of bans on use of contraceptive methods. Unlike India, where we are propagating family planning method. In European states, due to Christianity, Catholic belief, state often restricted propaganda about family planning or use of contraceptive method. But on their own, people felt so intensely that for their own development and for the development of their children, it is important that they have less number of children. And this is how fertility declined. In developing countries, family planning program is an important factor in decline of fertility. India was the first country in the world to launch a government-sponsored family planning program. Indian state, for the first time in the world anywhere, launched family planning program. China did not have family planning program for ideological reasons. In the beginning, Mao Zedong and Chinese leaders, communist leaders thought that population problem is a problem of capitalist society, bourgeois society. In socialist society, these problems will not exist. So any discussion of population trends in China in Mao's time and during Cultural Revolution was considered to be a kind of revisionism in socialist theory, a bourgeois attempt, a reactionary philosophy. So demographers, sociologists, family planning experts, those who talked of population growth in Mao's China were punished. Several of them lost their jobs, several of them were put behind bars. Demographic and sociology departments dealing with population were destroyed. So China, that was the reason, ideological reason why China at that time did not go for family planning. India was the first country to go for family planning program. So family planning is one factor. Development is another factor. Westernization, change of values, westernization. And maybe many other factors, not yet completely understood. Maybe biological factors, maybe some psychological factors, not fully dependent on these things, have been responsible for decline in fertility. Now, where do we stand today? With respect to demographic conditions, where do we stand today? today, at the end, I would like to give these a few figures to show the world situation. World, this is the data pertaining to 2009. World, more developed countries, less developed countries, and there is a category of least developed countries. The size of population of the world is 6.8 billion. 1.2 billion are living in more developed countries. 5.6 are living in less developed countries. We are part of less developed countries. And 0.8 are living in least developed countries. Least developed countries is a part of this. Otherwise, these two must add to this 6.8. This is the world situation. A certain number of countries of Africa, mostly Africa, they are classified as the least developed countries. So 0.8 billion population of the world is living in least developed countries. Growth rate. Growth rate of the world as a whole is 1.2% per year. The whole world population is growing. It is still growing. Malthusian fear of overpopulation as such has not become absent. World population is still growing at 1.2. And if 1.2 is maintained, then in 60 years' time we will double. We will become more than 13 billion. The world cannot sustain. Natural resources of this planet cannot sustain. But the good news is that this growth rate is declining. In the more developed countries, this growth rate has declined to 0.3% per year. In less developed countries, it is 1.4, and least developed countries 2.3. Least developed countries are still growing at Malthusian rate. Malthus is doubling in 25 years. So the least developed countries of Africa are still growing at a very high rate, 2.3. Projected population, what will happen in 2050? The world would be 9.1. More developed countries would be 1.3. Least developed countries will be 7.8. And least developed would be 1.7. Some of the developed countries like Germany, Austria, there are developed countries where the growth rate of population has already become negative. And they are facing problem of not explosion, but implosion of population, another type of risk, low fertility, implosion of population. On the average, to maintain equilibrium, we need an average family size of 2.1, 2.1 children. If all the couples have 2.1 children, then the population becomes stationary in the long run. But some of the developed countries have such a low fertility that total fertility rate or average number of children for them has gone down to 1.2, 1.1. 2 persons are getting replaced by 1.1 person in the next generation, leading to a negative rate of growth of population. So their problems are different. Less developed countries, as they become more advanced, they are also going to face the similar problem. As a whole, in India we still have high fertility, and some of our states have still very high fertility, more than 4. UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, for which earlier Ashish Bose used the acronym Bimaru states. Chhattisgarh was carved from Bimaru, BI for Bihar, MA for Madhya Pradesh, R for Rajasthan, and U for Uttar Pradesh. It makes Bimaru. So 40%, roughly 40% population of India lives in Bimaru states, and their average number of children is still very high. But more and more states of India are entering the below replacement fertility phase. The latest state to enter in this phase is Himachal Pradesh. Nobody earlier thought that any North Indian state will also have low fertility. But the last sample registration scheme data showed, and NFHS data, that Himachal Pradesh also has a fertility level much below 2. So more and more states are having less than 2. But overall, India is divided into two major parts. Vindhyachal divides India into two parts. On the south of Vindhyachal, you have the Europe, and more so Kerala state. In demographic terms, in population terms, Kerala can be called the Europe of India. And on the north of Vindhyachal, you have the Africa of India. And UP and Bihar are the most Africans of India. So there is a diversity. India is, because of this demographic transition, India is passing through a phase of demographic diversity. We expect that with more socio-economic development, with further reduction in death rate, infant mortality rate, and maternal mortality rate, and with more awareness, fertility will decline in UP and Bihar also. Some very powerful government-sponsored, civil society-sponsored family planning programs are going on. And we are hopeful that India will also attain a situation of equilibrium soon. Some diversity may remain. There may be deficit of children in Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Goa, Karnataka, Maharashtra. There will be some surplus of children in UP, Bihar, Rajasthan. But in India as a whole, we are more moving towards the condition of equilibrium. I think we stop here.